Hey everyone, it's Unique History Channel. Today we're going to be doing a reading from The Middle East Since 1945 by Stewart Ross, and we'll read Chapter 7, Lebanon Bleeds. Uneasy Peace. We saw in the earlier chapters how Lebanon was created when the French divided up the Ottoman province of Syria after the First World War. The ancient Syrian leagues are important, for they have re-emerged to play a major part in Lebanese history since 1945. We also saw how the country's constitution, leagued with an intercommunity power-sharing agreement, enabled the diverse but prosperous little state to weather the storms that beset so much of the Middle East after the Second World War. During the 1950s, President Camille Gamoun fell foul of his Arab neighbors for Lebanon's perceived pro-Western, pro-Israeli stance. The political acumen of General Shileb, commander of the Lebanese army, perhaps the short-lived appearance of the U.S. Marines, prevented serious unrest. Shihab then took over the partnership under his presidency and that of his successor. The country's stability held, enabling it to prosper, vigorous entrepreneur and financial center, serving the entire region. "Welcome to Beirut," declared a young Lebanese greeting a Western visitor in 1973. "Our city is the Paris of the Middle East. Everyone is happy, we have open minds and tolerate everything. A charming city Beirut might have been, but not everyone was happy and minds were closing fast. Barely 2 years later, the place had become hell on earth." Source of instability. The key to Lebanon's stability was harmonious relations between all the Christian and Muslim communities. More specifically, it meant for the country's main socio-religious groups, Maronite and Orthodox Christians, Druze, Sunnis, and Shia, sharing power. Tragically, the conditions allowing this to continue had been breaking down. Rapid urbanization, industrialization had led to 40% of the population living in the Beirut conurbarium. This had widened the gap between the largely Muslim countryside of the south and the urban Christians in the north and northeast. In Beirut itself, the separate ethnic and religious communities lived in distinct quarters. When trouble did flare up, the security services were notoriously heavy-handed. Lebanon refused to join the Arab cause against Israel in the Six-Day War of 1967 and the Yom Kippur War of 1973. The decision held hostility towards Lebanon in the Arab world, and within the country towards the Christian minority, controlled most of the influential positions. Among the Christians, the Maronites were particularly prominent. There was a talk of the secret agreements between the Christians, mainly the Maronites, and the Israelis. Ironically, the opposite was true. Unbeknownst, the Lebanese, Ben Gurion and Dayan, had actually talked of invading Lebanon and dismembering it. The influx of around 270,000 Palestinian refugees driven out by the war and Israeli policy had gradually added to Lebanon's difficulties. By 1973, 10% of those living in the country were Palestinians. Some had done well. For example, the country's largest construction company, CCC, was a Palestinian-owned. However, most were poor and landless. They shared many of the same grievances as the impoverished rural Muslims. Then came Black September, bringing the POL leadership and many of their followers from Jordan. They came with weapons in their own organization, above all, an independent and aggressive attitude. To many Lebanese, especially the Maronites, they were unwelcome swaggers. Just as in Jordan, they were a law unto themselves, collecting taxes, setting up roadblocks, and generally behaving as if they owned the place. In Beirut, it was made worse by the plentiful money and the city's cosmopolitan and easygoing atmosphere. The PLO bureaucracy became huge and corrupt, and some of its workers grew rich by selling its arms to Maronite Christians. Arafat kept the PLO accounts in a small notebook in his jacket pocket. He even found time for women in his life. It was all a long way from the rugged simplicity of Fatah's early years. The chaotic reality of Beirut did not match the outside world's image of the PLO. The international profile of Arafat and his organization was rising. For some years, Arafat had been playing down his terrorist image and representing himself as a peacemaker. Although the change cut little ice with the U.S. administration, elsewhere bore fruit. The PLO plan for solving the Israel-Palestine problem by the creation of two states was generally well received. In 1974, the Arab League Summit at Rabat declared the PLO the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. Later that year, Arafat addressed the United Nations, and following year, the PLO was given UN observer status. By a previous government signed in Cairo, the Lebanese government had given the PLO virtually free hand in organizing Palestinians in southern Lebanon, as long as it did not interfere in national politics. However, Palestinian attacks across the border in Israel, drawing heavy Israeli responses, inevitably involved the Lebanese government. The PLO's hope with local medical and education other facilities also gave it political status. It was a natural ally of the Lebanese national movement and the non-sectarian Lebanese forces. The LMN was led by Kemal Jumblat. This was a largely Shia party dedicated to improving the lot of the impoverished Muslim majority in the region. The spring of 1975 followed the confrontation between the country's militia groups, growing rapidly. Apart from the non-sectarian Lebanese army and the PLO, the most prominent military organization was the Christian Phalange. The motto of these inflexible, European-oriented, and right-wing paramilitaries was God, the Fatherland, and the family. Regarding themselves as descendants of ancient Phoenicians, not Arabs, the Phalange strongly rejected pan-Arabism and hated the PLO. Their 10,000-strong militia was well-armed and trained and ruthless, mainly Maronite Christians. The story of many horrific conflicts that tore Lebanon apart in the last quarter of the 20th century is irredescribably complex. Furthermore, the nation's deep wounds are still unhealed, so history emerged with politics. The narrative that follows, therefore, is a necessity much simplified. It is also based on their current thinking and knowledge factors that may well change the perspective of time. Civil War, the horror of war. Arguments about who was responsible for the outbreak of the Civil War persist to this day. The conflict did not start suddenly. Rather, Lebanon slid into war. The fishermen of Sidon went on strike, clashes with the authorities. Maronites fired on Palestinians, both Muslim and Orthodox Christians. Palestinians both fired on the Maronites, and the PLO joined with the LMN and sometimes the Lebanese non-sectarian army. After a Maronite Christian attack on refugees, the Phalange of Bashir Jamil clashed with the Phalange of his brother Amir. Sunni fought Shia, and Shia fought Druze, fought Orthodox Christian. By May 1975, Lebanon was in a total bloody chaos. One story among many illustrates the random, senseless nature of the killing. Christian militiamen were in the habit of stopping cars to check whether they were carrying Palestinians. As forged papers were easy to acquire, they set the occupants the language test: what is red and juicy, eaten with salad. The terrified integree with replied tomato. If they did so using the Lebanese word bandadora, they were allowed to go. If they said bandora, the Palestinian version of the word, they were instantly killed or worse. Central government collapsed, and the local war bonds imposed what they could. Arms poured into the country from around the world, particularly from Syria, Israel, the United States, Iran, and the Soviet Union. The factions stockpiled sophisticated weaponry like rocket launchers and the artillery, as well as the rifles and grenades, by the container load. There had never been a civil war like it. The firepower and the daily use was awesome and terrifying. Thousands of Lebanese fled abroad. Dwellings were shattered and businesses wrecked, communications cut. Around 70,000 people lost their lives, most of them innocent civilians. Foreign players. Many governments kept a close eye on the Lebanese situation. A significant number of intervened with arms and money, some in the most unexpected way. The majority of Arab oil producers, for instance, sided with the Maronites and the non-sectarian Lebanese army because they feared the communist leanings of some of the Palestinian groups, mainly the PLO. The CIA in Israel also helped the Christians, along with funds from Mexico's Maronite community. Iraq supported the PLO. No one watched what was going on more closely than Syria's President Assad. Until the end of 1975, he gave support to Muslim groups and the non-sectarian Lebanese army. By the early next year, he was having doubts. If the Muslim won, as now seemed likely, Lebanon would either be divided or become a left-leaning state dominated by the PLO. The new situation would be acceptable to Israel, which would certainly intervene. To prevent this happening, Assad switched support mainly to the non-sectarian Lebanese army and some of the Maronite Christians. This produced an extraordinary situation of Israel and Syria. Sworn enemies and still technically at war, both backing the same side in a civil war on their borders, Assad received U.S. assurance and the Israelis would not object, and sent 20,000 Syrian troops into Lebanon from the east. To the west, Israeli warships blockaded the coast and enforced their strong links with Bashar Jamiel. The Lebanese Civil War surrounded the death knell of the Pan-Arabism. It presented a most distressing image of Arabs to the outside world. Moreover, it played into the hands of Israel, giving an ample excuse to expand its northern frontier if considered expedient. Finally, the civil war was being exploited by Assad by the time he was vying for Egypt for leadership of the Arab world. It enabled him to pose defender of Muslims and as the other peoples as well, and a peacemaker. Eventually acting on the Saudi Kuwait Egyptian initiative, a ceasefire was agreed. Very roughly, the Muslim groups LMN and the PLO and some of the Druze were left controlling most of the south. Until his assassination the following year, Jumblat was their overall political leader. The north was in mainly Maronite Christian hands, with the Orthodox Christian minority also living there. A green line ran through the center of Beirut, dividing all the Christians east and the Muslims west, and 30,000 Arab League troops, mostly Syrian, patrolled as peacekeepers. The Israeli intervention, incompetent ceasefire. The ceasefire, agreed in October 1976, brought a reduction in the violence, but not its complete cessation. The Phalange were still under arms, as was the LMN and other groups. The clashes between them and smaller groups persisted. Syrian forces remained in the country too. In the north and in the eastern Beirut, Bashar Jamiel had combined most of the Maronite groups to form a fiefdom of his own. He was happy to receive Israeli support. The PLO's strength was predominantly in the south of the country after the Lebanese Civil War had increased its governmental role. It used some of the funds provided by support of states organizations to help restore electricity, water, communications in the areas shattered by the conflict. The less corrupt PLO operatives also sought to build a better future, extending a network of schools and medical clinics in the Palestinian areas. Furthermore, Arafat had agreed with the Lebanese and Syrian governments to cut back on Palestinian attacks on Israel. Despite his poor organizational ability, Arafat was trying to put forward the PLO as a viable government for a separate Palestine. It's tied in with the developments beyond Arafat's control, two alarming, one potentially favorable. The former were growing accord between Egypt and Israel and the election of Mohammed Begin as Israel's prime minister. The ex-Eingrun commander now headed the Likud front, a right-wing nationalist coalition. The two setbacks were some extent balanced in the election of Democrat Jimmy Carter to the U.S. presidency in 1976, and on his first actions was to declare himself in favor of Palestinian homeland. Arafat's state-building efforts, the PLO, were like a totally antonym to Begin. Like his labor predecessor, the Likud government maintained pressure on the PLO by constant and fairly indiscriminate cross-border attacks. These were not just retaliatory. Rather, in the light of the PLO's restraint, they were intended to be proactive. The Israelis themselves called themselves preventative, rather like the Anglo-American invasion of Iraq in 2003. The Israeli government did not want the PLO questioned. It wanted it removed, disbanded, and liquidated. It therefore needed PLO attacks on Israel for an excuse of missions on its own. Arafat was never consistent, nor did he have control over all the Palestinian territory. In March 1978, an 11-man Fatwa hit squad made their own way down the coast and landed near Haifa. They intended to reach Tel Aviv and were confused by their surroundings. In due course, finding the main road between Haifa and the capital, they decided to make the most of the opportunity. Their attack on a bus left 37 dead and 78 injured. This was just the excuse Bening needed. He ordered the IDF to advance into southern Lebanon and destroyed PLO bases. Arafat led resistance in person, fighting as he always did with immense bravery. It was to no avail. 2,000 people were killed, almost all of them Palestinians and some Lebanese people. Around 250,000 people were rendered homeless. Operation Latini, as it was called, established a security zone on River Latini, patrolled by the Israeli-backed South Lebanese Army. This accomplished, the IDF withdrew. Henceforward, the PLO had to tread more warily in the south, along its bases further north were unharmed. Israeli invasion, the advance of the right. The positions of extreme Israelis and Palestinians had much in common. Each rejected a compromise and denied the rights of the other to exist. Both saw the conflict between them as a fight to the death. However, by 1980, the bulk of Palestinians, including Arafat, realized they would never be able to wipe Israel from the map. Hence, Arafat's two-state solution, Israel and Palestine as separate, independent countries, and the circumstances it was best he could hope for. It was not the best that the Israelis could hope for. Their deal with Egypt, exchanging land for peace, was still a desired template of most mainstream politicians. It invoked a backhandling of some of the lands from those whom had been taken, Jordanians and Syrians, but not to the Palestinians. To this end, hardline Israelis were prepared to do any length to reduce the power and influence of the PLO. By the early 1980s, the Israeli right was riding high. First, Benny was re-elected as prime minister. Second, two hardliners, Yitzhak Shamir and Ariel Sharon, entered as government foreign ministers and defense ministers, respectively. Third, Jimmy Carter had fallen foul of the media, and the new militant Iranian regime of Ayatollah Khomeini failed to get re-elected. He has place taken by Ronald Reagan, the Republican president, and his slow-witted Secretary of State, Alexander Haig, regard Israel as a strategic asset in their battle against communism. This meant publicly supporting the Likud administration, and almost it did, even though it might disagree in private. By 1981, Begin's government officially annexed the Golan Heights, next showing how ruthless it was prepared to be in defense of the country's interests. It ordered the destruction of an Iraqi nuclear plant under construction in the Oziraq. In Operation Babylon, Israeli F-16 fighters with F-15 fighter protection completely destroyed the site. Israeli planes and tackled the PLO headquarters in Beirut, leaving 300 civilians dead. A U.S.-prompted ceasefire was broken, and declared again and broken again. Shamir and Sharon were determined an all-out invasion of Lebanon. Its purpose would be threefold: the final destruction of the PLO, and the establishment of a pro-Israel government in Lebanon headed by Bashir Jamil, and war with Syria that would force it to accept peace on terms similar to Egypt's. Jordans would have no choice to follow suit. They reasoned, leaving Israel secure, the PLO feeble and homeless, and non-Israeli Palestinians obliged to become citizens of the states in which the area they lived. Arafat refused to play ball. Despite repeated Israeli incursions into Lebanon, the PLO did not retaliate. The Israeli command was finally received by events in London, England. On June 3rd, 1981, the Israeli ambassador to Great Britain was shot dead outside the five-star Dorchester Hotel. The gunman belonged to Abdul Nidal, a terrorist gang whose leader had been expelled from the PLO for attempting to assassinate Yasser Arafat. Begin had no time for such details. To him, all Arab terrorists were the same. 3 days after the London murder, 1,240 Israeli tanks rolled over Israel's northern border into Lebanon. Peace for Galilee. The Israeli invasion was named Operation Peace for Galilee. Although there had been little to no fighting in Galilee for years, it was another example of the skillful Israeli propaganda. However unjustified the assault, the combination of peace and Galilee instinctively warmed the hearts of Christians the world over, not least those of mainstream Americans. In the military terms, the advance was a blistering success. The invaders did not stop in the south as they said they would, but powered on to Beirut to link up with the Maronite forces of Bashir Jamil. Resistance from the PLO, Muslim groups, and the Syrians was crushed, and the Syrian Air Force losing dozens of planes. Thousands were killed, mostly Arabs and many of them civilians. Assad's accepted ceasefire, and immediately the Lebanese government soon followed suit. The international outcry against the invasion was loud and virtually unanimous. Words, however, were not enough. The only country with the power and influence to limit Israeli policy, the U.S., was reluctant to ditch any ally policy to which had tactical approval to permit Begin to pay his $1 million a day venture, remaining largely intact. The international outcry against the invasion was loud and virtually unanimous. Words, however, were not enough. The only country with short in the military invasion, there was little anyone else could do. Certainly Arab states were not prepared to get involved. We have seen now before how little for the Palestinians, nor were they willing to risk much for a country that had stood on the sidelines in 1967 and 1973. Egypt at peace with Israel and had expelled from the Arab League did nothing. Jordan saw no point in intervening, and Saddam Hussein's reign, already at war with Iran, had neither the desires nor the means to get involved. On July 1st, the PLO fighters were holed up in West Beirut, surrounded by Israeli and Maronite forces. The Israelis did not want to get involved in deadly street-to-street fighting. Instead, as previously agreed, they asked their ally Jamiel to go in and root out the enemy. Jamiel refused. The Israelis began to realize that they had fully underestimated the man. He wanted to govern a fully independent Lebanon, not a puppet state. He had no more wanted his country to be dominated by Israel or the PLO. The siege of West Beirut intensified with regular bombing, artillery, and rocket attacks. Supplies of water and electricity were cut. Prime Minister Begin, it seems, was on some under illusion of the heart of Beirut as akin to Hitler's bunker in Berlin during the Second World War. I feel as Prime Minister, he telegraphed to Ronald Reagan, empowered and instructed valiant army facing Beirut. By equating Arafat with Hitler, this remark demonstrates how rigidly the men of Begin's generation were tied to their hideous past. They were unable to see the present for what it was, regarding it instead as a form of a nightmare, endlessly repeating what had been. In this most desperate of situations, once again, Arafat showed the extraordinary bravery and remarkable instincts for survival. The Israelis wanted him dead. Time and again, their spies marked the buildings where he was supposed to be in, and came the warplanes. Buildings were destroyed, and he emerged somewhere, smiling, his shoes to finally be polished, and his distinctive head dress intact. Journalists and soldiers alike testified to the unique ability to rouse the shattered Palestinian forces, taking men by the arm, encouraging them, assuring them that in the end victory would be theirs. Beirut will be the Hanoi and the Stalingrad of the Israeli army. He equipped with the irresponsible optimism. Once it is certain that the PLO was on the verge of surrender, a group of high-ranking Lebanese officials came to wish Arafat bon voyage. Introducing them, a Palestinian official told his leader that the delegation had come to say goodbye. Ah, Arafat replied, where are they going? The whole room bursting out laughing. The remark itself was not particularly amusing. What attracted so to the persistent, cheerful, joyous was the indestructibility of a man whose immediate prospects were not about nil. Eventually, on August 12th, President Reagan called Prime Minister Begin in person. The fighting in Beirut had to stop, he warned. Did the victims of the Holocaust really wish to be the perpetrators of another such horror? The guns fell silent almost immediately. An international peacekeeping force of mainly American, French, and Italian troops was called in to supervise the ceasefire. The PLO and its supporters were escorted from West Beirut into exile in the country that would take them. Arafat sent a lonely figure sailed away to Tunisia, where he reestablished his PLO headquarters. In order to get re-elected as the government president of Lebanon, Bashir Jamiel had denounced the Israeli president in the country. Begin's policy was clearly beginning to unravel. True, the PLO had been driven out of Lebanon, but there was nothing to stop them or similar groups returning. And the economic and political cost had been enormous. The vast reservoir of international sympathy for the Jews present since the Holocaust was rapidly drying up. U.S. friendship had been sorely tested. Syrian forces remained in eastern Lebanon, supporting PLO remnants in the El Bekaa Valley. Unnecessary Israeli aggression made enemies of the Druze, the Orthodox Christians, and the Lebanese Shias. The creation of Hezbollah, the Party of God, an Iranian-backed terrorist group that would prove even more intractable than the PLO, can be traced directly to Israeli attacks on previous neutral Shia village. Worse was to come. The removal of the PLO had left the Palestinians alarmingly vulnerable to attacks from their Maronite enemies. One spark would be enough to re-invite fire and inspire the Maronite militia to another orgy of slaughter. What came, in fact, was not a spark but a bonfire. President-elect Bashir Jamiel was blown to tiny pieces by a bomb that destroyed the Falange headquarters. His body was so mutilated that his wife had to identify him by a wedding ring on his severed hand. The Falange were rocked to the very core. Many of them refused to believe their leader, the man who symbolized all they stood for, was dead. Rumors soon circulated that he had been seen walking uninjured from the ruins in the building when the bomb went off, making his way to a mysterious ambulance. One day, when his people were in great danger, he would return like King Arthur to save them. For the time being, the Phalange sought revenge. Everyone in Lebanon knew this. The Israeli forces knew it too, as did their political masters back home. What happened in the next is still disputed. Nevertheless, it seems clear that Sharon and Israeli military leaders on the spot approved the entrance of the armed Phalange into the bands of the Palestinian camps of Sabra and Shatila, and their escorts were well aware. It was not enough nor a social call. They remained there for 3 days, engaging in the ghastly orgy of slaughter, torture, mutilation, and rape. The IDF, knowing full well that something terrible was happening, did not intervene until they were tired of the screams. The death toll was probably never to be known, but is thought to be around 2,000 men, women, and children. Israel's Lebanese policy was in tatters. As estimated, 400,000 Israelis filled the streets of Tel Aviv to protest the IDF's role in killing passive authorized there. Government condemned the massacre too, but denied all responsibility. Public measure eventually forced Sharon to leave his post in the defense ministry, although he remained in the cabinet. A government inquiry exonerated the IDF from the base. The Sabra and Shatila massacres were investigated by many others, including international bodies and the Israeli journalists. None of their reports supported the view that the Sharon and his forces were entirely innocent. In the May following the Sabra and Shatila massacres, Israel negotiated an armistice with President Amin Jamiel, the brother of the assassinated Bashir. It lasted only a year until abrogated under Muslim and Syrian pressure. In that time, the increasingly unpopular IDF, subject to violent persistent attacks from all sides, had begun its painful withdrawal from the southern security zone, which had established during its previous invasion. Meanwhile, the international peacekeeping force was also coming under attack. In the spring of 1983, a number of Italians, Americans, and French were killed by a group whose name meant nothing at the time, Islamic Jihad. Within weeks, it would be on everyone's lips. And in April, Islamic Jihad suicide bomber drove explosives into an American embassy, and it killed 63 people. The operation is part of the Iranian Revolution's campaign against the imperialist presence throughout the world. President Reagan, the would-be gunslinger that he was, immediately went on the offensive. His men were no longer in Lebanon on the peace mission. They were there to defend President Jamiel and crush his enemies, the Druze, the Syrians, Orthodox Christians, and the Shia. All of them used Soviet-made weapons. Reagan argued that they must be communist at first. This was not just a civil war in Lebanon, it was part of the U.S.'s worldwide crusade against the evil empire of the Red Flag. Following a ceasefire in 1989, the Saudi government invited the Lebanese parliament to the Hilton of Taif to work out a new power-sharing agreement. The multi-millionaire Lebanese businessman Rafik al-Hariri, a prominent member of the Shia community, funded the visit. It was eventually produced a fresh compromise with no immediate end to the instability of fighting. A new president was elected and promptly assassinated. General Aoun rejected the Taif Accord, attempted to escort Syrian forces to re-enter the country. This time, regarded as most parts of the necessary inconvenience. The country was exhausted. Over 25% of its population had fled abroad. 150,000 people had been killed, and hundreds of thousands had been made homeless. Not a single family in the land had escaped suffering and loss. Hariri, now Prime Minister, set about getting the country back on its feet again. His wealth, business acumen, and worldwide contacts made him an ideal man for the task. Nevertheless, the probability of all the deals made by Mr. Miracle, as Hariri was known, did not always bear scrutiny. Although there was never a definite decline in violence as a marked economic recovery in Lebanon, less progress was made in the south, where the borders of Lebanon, Israel, and Syria met. Eventually, the IDF left the region in May 2000. The withdrawal left some forces unresolved, and among those were ownership on the enclave of the Golan Heights, known as the Sheba Farms, and ongoing presence of Syrian forces in Lebanon, and the ongoing anti-Israel activities of Hezbollah and Islamic Jihad. Real and lasting peace was still a long way off.